Hey that síðan rach, þögt the slapenda, besirda wurda, theovis krafta. That's a thewdan fand, bu folk berna, that hey ya bolgen was. Lines 2217 to 2220 of Beowulf, which mean something like, he avenged that later. Though while sleeping he had been tricked by the thief's cunning. The people discovered, all the house dwellers, that the dragon was angry. These lines come from an episode of Beowulf, where a thief steals a cup, enraging the dragon from whose hoard it came. And the dragon subsequently takes out its vengeance on the nearest inhabitants. The relevance of this episode to fans of Tolkien will be obvious. In The Hobbit, Tolkien gives a nod to Beowulf when he has Bilbo steal a cup from the hoard of Smaug, the dragon who takes out its vengeance on the inhabitants of Lake Town. It's one of many examples of Tolkien's use of Old English poetry and Old Norse sagas. I'm Philip Chase, and welcome back to my YouTube channel on the best of fantasy. Today's video will be something a little different. We'll be looking at the medieval influences on the work of J.R.R. Tolkien, specifically Old English and a bit of Old Norse. In fact, related to the episode from The Hobbit that I just spoke about, the encounter between Bilbo and Smaug, there is another well-known incident in the saga of the Volsungs, where Sigurd, the greatest hero of Germanic legend, encounters and slays Fafnir, a very crafty dragon. Similar to how Smaug tries to get Bilbo to tell him who he is, Fafnir does the same with Sigurd in order to perhaps curse him. In fact, many great fantasy authors draw from various historical periods. George R.R. Martin, famously from the 15th century. Susanna Clarke draws from the early 19th century in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. And another example is Scott Lynch, whose Gentleman Bastards series has echoes of Renaissance Italy. But Tolkien was perhaps a special case because he was in fact a scholar of Old English, who was well-versed not only in Old English, but in Old Norse and many other languages. So Old English and Old Norse are among the influences that inform Tolkien's work, from character names to plot points to prominent themes. And I'm going to be giving a few examples in this video, starting with a poem from the Elder Edda, the Voluspa, which is really a crazy poem that tells of the end of the world, Ragnarok. But one section of the Voluspa is called the Dvergatal, which is in fact the catalog of the dwarves. I'm going to read a few names of these dwarves from Norse mythology, and Tolkien fans will find them quite familiar. For example, there's Durin, Dane, Dvalin, Bifur, Bofur, Bombur, Nori, Fili Kili, and Eken Skaldi, which means in fact Oakenshield. And also there's Gandalf. Yes, Tolkien took the name for his wizard from a dwarf in Old Norse. But the influence of Old Norse and Old English goes beyond just mere names at times. One great example is the character Jarandil from the Silmarillion. Jarandil is the name that Tolkien as a young man encountered in the poem Christ. Let me read the section in question of the Christ poem. Jala Jarandil, engla berchtust, over middanjard, monum sended, on solfasta, sunnun leoma, tocht over tunglas, thu tida Johanna, of silvan the simla in lichtes. And these words mean something like, Hail, Jarandil, brightest of angels, over Middle Earth, sent to men, and true light of the sun, bright above the stars for every season, you of yourself shine forever. So the young Tolkien read this name, Eärendil, and found it to be a beautiful word, a word that simply inspired him. And he alludes to this fact in one of his letters that he wrote. This is actually letter number 297 in the Letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, edited by Humphrey Carpenter, where Tolkien refers to the influence that this word had on him. And he says, I was struck by the great beauty of this word. So you can see where the linguistic influence was important in the formation of Tolkien's story making. And in fact, the character Eärendil has some thematic resonances with the Eärendil of the Old English poem. Eärendil in the poem seems to be a reference to the dawn star, which is today we call it Venus, which comes up just before the sunrise, a bright star. It's taken, in fact, as a herald of the sun, a sign of hope. When the Anglo-Saxons had been Christianized, they took this as a symbol of John the Baptist, who was a herald to the coming of Christ. Tolkien takes his character Eärendil in a similar manner, and there's the connection with the star is important as well. If you're familiar with the Silmarillion, you'll know what I'm speaking of. Eärendil sailed to Aman to seek the help of the Valar against Morgoth, who was Sauron's boss back in the day. And Morgoth was essentially running the show. The elves and the humans were losing, and it was a big catastrophe. So as a last-ditch effort, Eärendil sailed to the west with a Silmaril in order to seek the aid of the Valar. Consequently, the Valar decided to make of Eärendil and his ship, and Elwing as well, a star. The Silmaril becomes a star. So you can see that Tolkien kept the astrological association of Eärendil in his story in the Silmarillion. And there is also the thematic resonance of a herald that brings about a kind of divine salvation, the coming of the Valar to save humans and elves from Morgoth and his minions. And there's another interesting echo of this story of Eärendil in Old Norse, in Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda. He tells a story of a time when Thor was returning from slaying the giant Hrungnir. And in the process of fighting this giant, Thor had a whetstone lodged in his head. And to get this whetstone out, he consulted a witch named Groa. And she was casting her spells to get the whetstone out of Thor's head when Thor decided, in gratitude, to tell her that he had recently returned from Giantland with her husband, a character, a hero named Aurvandil, which is Old Norse cognate with Eärendil. And Thor had rescued this Jorvandil from the giants and was bringing him home in a basket. Unfortunately, it was very cold there, and Jorvandil's toe was sticking out of the basket and it froze. So Thor tells Groa that he snapped the toe off and threw it up into the sky, where it became a star called Jorvandil's toe. So there again, you have this probably ancient association with the name and the star, and kind of an amusing story. By the way, Groa didn't get the whetstone out of Thor's head because she became elated with the news that her husband had returned. So Thor basically went around with a whetstone in his head from there on after. Another example of a word in Old English that inspired Tolkien is the Arkenstone, the precious gem of the dwarves, which is kind of the center of the narrative of the Hobbit toward the end. This is the stone which, of course, Thorin wanted so badly. It was the heart of the treasure of the dwarves of the Lonely Mountain. This is a name that Tolkien takes from Old English, Arkenstone, which appears several times, actually, in that Christ poem, as well as in Beowulf. After Beowulf slays Grendel, in gratitude, Hrothgar and company give him a whole heap of treasures, including a marvelous necklace that is called an Arkenstone, which means something like precious gem in Old English. Incidentally, in Beowulf, the necklace in question is also compared to the Brisingamen, which is the necklace of the goddess Freya. A lot of stories behind that. But perhaps the most obvious use of Old English in Tolkien's work would be the Riders of Rohan, the Rohirrim. Of course, Rohan and Rohirrim are not Old English words. Those are Elvish words, Sindarin to be specific. In fact, the Riders of Rohan refer to themselves as Erlingas, which in Old English would simply mean the people of Erl. The use of Old English in the culture of the Erlingas is pervasive. All the names mean something in Old English. So for example, Theoden, the king, his name simply means prince. And Eomer is horse fame. Eowyn, horse joy. You get the idea. There are many other examples of characters whose names come from Old English, such as Saruman, and also Orthanc and Isengard as well. And Smeagol is an Old English name. And there are many, many other examples which we simply don't have time for in this video. But it might be also interesting to note that Middle Earth itself, of course, is an Old English word, Midanjard or Midgard in Old Norse. But beyond all the names, there are also important thematic influences from Old English poetry in Tolkien's work. I'll give one specific example from Lord of the Rings. It's the Battle of Hornburg. And at this particular moment, it looks like all is lost. And the orcs are about to charge in, and the good guys are on their back feet. And Theoden is getting ready, the old king is getting ready to ride out to battle, his last battle. And he says, "The world changes, and all that once was strong now proves unsure." This sense of fleetingness, that ultimately life is swallowed by death, is something you find all over Old English poetry. And that, by the way, is a moment that in the Peter Jackson films, they actually do even more with. When Theoden is getting all his armor put on, he recites basically a bit of poetry, which is almost certainly inspired by Old English. And I'll give you an example from the poem The Wanderer, where you see this ubi sunt theme play out. Ubi sunt is a Latin for where are they? And it's basically meaning that life is fleeting, that everything disappears. So the Wanderer is from the Exeter book, just like the Christ poem. And just have a listen to this. This is some beautiful poetry. Whar kom merg, whar kom mago, whar kom mathum giva, whar kom simbla gesetu, whar sindon sela dremas, e alla berchte bunna, e alla birnwiga, e alla theodnistrim, hu sea thragiwat yanap under nicht helm, swahe nawara. Which means something like, where has the steed gone? Where the kinsman? Where the treasure giver? Where is the feasting place? Where the hall joys? Alas for the bright cup. Alas, the mailed warrior. Alas, the prince's glory. How that time has departed, darkened under night's shadow, as if it never were. This theme of life's fleetingness is something that Tolkien most certainly picks up on, and it is part of the sorrow and beauty of The Lord of the Rings. Like any great writer, Tolkien had many influences, but it's pretty apparent that Old English and Old Norse are among the most important for Tolkien. In my next videos, I'll be discussing some more of the greats of fantasy, so I'll hope you stay tuned, and until then.